to the degree that we were all told during the Cold War they were against us. Do you think that there was some kind of put-up job on an enormous scale here?
I don't know whether, and I don't mean to be talking down to anybody,
No.
most of all present company. The Cold War started before the end of World War II. Our OSS people made contact with what they considered to be valuable intelligence agents within the Russian sphere before the war ended, when the Russians were still our allies. And they exfiltrated those people, about 50-50, Nazis and pro-Nazis. And Mr. Dulles' deputy, Frank Wisner, was stationed in Bucharest. Dulles was in Switzerland, was in Bucharest, Romania. And we had a lot of POWs, American air crews in Romania, that we'd been bombing the Ploesti oil fields. A lot of planes were shot down because all low-level bombing. And so it was a humanitarian effort for Wisner to try to find ways to get these POWs out. In the brief interval, by the time the Russian army was coming into Romania across that border, and the German army was fleeing out of Romania in the northwest border. So in that some 2-week period, he put together a freight train, a big freight train, and he put 750 Americans on that freight train, POWs. And these Nazis that he was taking out, he stuck them in the freight train. So he got them out of there. Well, now, the object of the whole thing was viewing, from their point of view, the OSS point of view, and they had British help in this, that the enemy in the future, the post-war future, was going to be communism. And so they bring these guys out, and the freight train went through the Balkans with the doors sealed like any freight train, came out in Turkey, and as it entered Turkey, General Giles, who was a commanding general in Cairo, head of the Middle East Command, called my boss at Cairo, and I happened to be chief pilot there. He said, have planes enough to go up there and pick these men up and bring them out when they get off the train, because after the train goes through Turkey on this regular track that's there, it goes, because there were mountains, it goes into Syria for several miles, and it's only just barely across the border, but it's in Syria. So my boss, a general named Smith, and I went up there the day before and reconnoitered the ground, because no airfield, and we found a place we could operate from. And we talked to the British who were stationed there, and they said it was a pretty good deal. So we went up, took 40 airplanes the next day and went up there, and we just landed and waited, and sure enough, here came the freight train, and it stopped. And the doors opened, and out came these guys just running across that place. And so we'd fill one airplane and send them out, and the next plane, and the next plane. And I had the general's plane, which had plush seats and all, and the last guys to come out, some of them had been injured, and we had nurses with us and all, got on my plane to go out, and I noticed that some other guys just standing in the aisle that looked just kind of extra, because I wasn't on the other plane. I didn't realize there were so many of them, and they weren't Americans, and they were these Romanians and whatever from the Balkans, plus Nazis that they had gotten to change over, see. Like Galen did, the head of German intelligence, General Galen, changed, and he was picked up the same way, but he went out through Germany. And I brought these fellows down to Cairo. Well, the minute they got to Cairo, there were cars there to whisk them off, and we never saw them again. But that's evidence of the beginning of the Cold War, because that was in September of '44, and the German surrender came in May of '45.
Well, I guess what I was getting at was the Cold War truly a real thing? Because, in other words, if our bankers are running the banks in Russia, was the Cold War an honest conflict, or was it something where it was just done to sort of suck money out of the American people and the Russian people and put a bogeyman, you know, that we were the bogeyman for the Russians, am I right? And they were the bogeyman for us. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there was any
If you read Buckminster Fuller's enormously important book called Critical Path, a computer term, Critical Path, he states very clearly that the so-called Cold War created expenditures, and he died in 83, so he's talking about 45 to 83, of over $6 trillion. Now, if $6 trillion had not changed hands and then multiplied as it changed between 45 and 83, there would have been, our business world would have been a lot different than it was, including the Soviets' business world and the British and everybody else. Or, as the book I quote so often, the Leonard Lewin's book, The Report from Iron Mountain, our governments do not know how to operate without the threat of war. They just, and he says that Kennedy started a commission of people to study what we had to do to run a nation in a time of permanent peace, when you could just say you don't need a Defense Department. He said, you know, well, how are you going to do it? No question about it. You know, that's astounding when you realize that that kind of information has been floating around in the government and in the public for, my goodness, years.
Well, didn't it come up at the recent conference? In fact, didn't it said that the Bay of Pigs was really meant to fail, and that it was meant to sort of engage Kennedy in a larger... he was put in a fait accompli where he had to invade Cuba. Was that brought up?
No, that wouldn't have been me.
Okay.
No, because...
Do you agree with that?
No. I don't think they ever really intended to do away with Castro. Castro's convenient, just like Khrushchev was convenient. Stalin was convenient, when you think about it. No, it's a different play of the game, because if Castro was a problem, we get rid of him. I mean, what did we do with Quirino? We gave Lansdale a blank checkbook, and we got rid of Quirino. No problem. They weren't happy with No Dindium and his brother. Somehow or other they got killed. I mean, what are we talking about here? Castro, 90 miles away, we can't find out how to take the air out of his tires?
So what do you think is his strategic purpose, or why do you think we haven't taken Castro out? I mean, we're acting
no real necessity.
Well, we act as though he's such a menace and such a problem.
You got to have a problem. See, you got to have a problem. You can't govern a nation without the threat of war. And they always say Castro was going to be the base for the missiles. You know, it was always very convenient to say that 90 miles away. My God, you can fire any old missiles ever built 90 miles away.
Have to worry all the time.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
And yet, why does Castro leave Guantanamo on his? Yeah. See, it sounds like a very serious business, and then when you think about it carefully, it sounds very childish. The script for this movie isn't much good. It's got no chance of getting an Oscar.
Have you ever written a screenplay? Have you ever thought of making a film dramatizing some of the things you know?
I write so much anyway, and read so much that, what do they say? I've always got something on my plate. Yeah. I've thought of them. In fact, right now it's a question of whether I should start in on my autobiography, because I have kind of a strange personal feeling that if I don't write it down, just like talking with you people, whom I figure are quite well informed, much better than average, and yet there are so many things we talk about that you haven't heard of, that I keep thinking, you know, I should set this down. And it's not just for these subjects. I got involved, and I don't know how this started. I was a branch manager of the bank in the Pentagon. Well, it happens to be the biggest bank in the whole Washington area in terms of people. You know, in the Pentagon, my God, 35,000 people sitting on your shoulders, all wanting to cash their paychecks. But anyway, I happened to be branch manager. So the directors of the bank thought it'd be a good idea to take that old stupid Air Force colonel and send him to school. So they sent me to the American Bankers Association Graduate School of Banking at Madison, Wisconsin, and I graduated from there. Well, while I was there, I met a young man who was from the American Bankers Association and was in charge of the computerization programs for banks, which at those days was in the future. I mean, they all still scribbled little notes and put them in big bins and kept records that way. But the computer world was coming up, see? Well, he found out, this man at the Wisconsin school, that because I had been in the military, I was very familiar with computers. I was the first person to put an entire Air Force command, 77,000 people, and all their records on a computer back in 1951, I guess, something like that. And he thought, hey, can you do that with banks? You know, oh, well, just buy the computers, cinch. So the American Bankers Association created an organization called the Committee on Automation, Planning, and Technology. And although I came from a very small bank on a relatively basis, I was a charter member of that committee, and I worked with them for a couple of years converting the banking system to computers. And that meant creating this horrible thing we call credit cards. And after we got the banks in, we all got thinking, yeah, but what about the Federal Reserve System? Why aren't they in this? So I was hired to be a consultant to a firm out here that has made its reputation and its money on ticket sales for airlines. You know, there were reservations for airlines called AirInc, and they're computer experts. And on a, considering the years we're talking about back in the mid-'60s, they were a real fine. So the Federal Reserve System got a contract with AirInc, and AirInc hired me as a consultant, and we put the Federal Reserve System on computers. Well, I only cite that because, again, I never dreamed of either working for a bank, going to the school, working in computers, and putting the Federal... I kind of feel bad I put the Federal Reserve on computers. It would have been better the way it was. But, you know, to recapitulate the era and to try to explain it the way it went for those of us involved, I feel a certain responsibility that I should do that. But it sounds kind of funny to throw that on top of the Bay of Pigs or the U-2 or some other things, you know, they don't seem to fit, but that's exactly how they happened, you see. And then while I was in the bank, we tried to get new accountants. And I read in the paper about the Congress being so bold as to start an organization called Amtrak. Well, at that time, it wasn't called Amtrak. They invented the name later, but, you know, Amtrak, the passenger railroad. And I thought, my God, there'd be nothing better than to get a passenger railroad system going. And they're going to have a lot of money. There's all this, they got to fund it. So I went to a man on the board, what do you call it, the organizing board of this new company, and asked where they were going to keep their funds and everything. Would he put them in the bank in the Pentagon? You know, we could take care of them. And we got talking, and he said, hey, he said, we got a bigger problem than that. The minute we open, we have to have offices all over the United States so that this railroad system can do business with the government and with the military. We want a director to handle government and military sales for the railroad. Why don't you do that and hell with the bank? I said, you know, it sounds good, General. So I joined him, and I toyed with the trains for 10 years. Well, now, I'd never dreamed of doing that either. And yet, in the process, I had a very unusual career there. I became the president of the corporation, 3 different presidents, speechwriter for 6 years. I wrote all the speeches, all the things, all the public word for Amtrak. I happened to be the writer. Well, I've always felt that if you're a writer, you have to know something. So I started reading railroad books and meeting railroad people, and I was absolutely stunned to find out how little railroad people knew about railroads. They just figure you buy a few trains and a locomotive and send it down the track. And really it's about that, you know. So I went to England and France and Japan. The president of the Japanese Railroad invited me over there, and I went all up and down that beautiful system they have, and I began to know about railroads. So one day the McGraw-Hill Scientific Encyclopedia called me up, and they said, listen, we have to have a section on railroad engineering in our encyclopedia. And I said, well, I'm not an engineer. Yeah, but we can't find any railroad engineers. You write it. So I did. Well, I had written a book for the Air Force on aeronautics. I thought I could write a railroad book. I did. It's strange to fall into those different things, but in a way they're related. You try to take existing facts and relate them to the public. And I could apparently do that, whether it was a speech for the president of Amtrak or the article for the Scientific Encyclopedia. And what happens when you spend a life in that kind of thing is you begin to get seriously concerned about the degradation of the infrastructure of this country. It shouldn't be like it is. We've got $42 billion worth of bridges in this country that have been condemned and need repair because the railroads no longer carry the heavy freight. It's on trucks, and the trucks are heavier than the bridges were built. They couldn't visualize these big trucks when they built those bridges 40, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And there's many cities and towns that can't be served by trucks with a full load. The railroads don't go there anymore. Railroads used to go to 45,000 communities. Now they only go to 13,000. And wheat growing in Nebraska is piled up in the streets in some of the towns, and neither trucks nor trains can come get it, so it rots. Now that's a fine state of affairs for the, quote, greatest nation in the world. We're in bad shape. But you don't get to the point where you can support that statement until you've seen it, like the failure of the Bay of Pigs or the stupid flight of the U-2 or what goes on in the railroads. They're interrelated, really. It's the fact that so much in this country today has deteriorated, is on the brink of deterioration, that really we have become the most dependent society ever created in mankind. We wouldn't know where to get a red apple on a tree if we had to do it ourselves. We wouldn't know. Do you know where the bread you eat is baked? Have you got the slightest idea? In Washington, 90% of our bread is baked up in Pennsylvania. So without trucks, we wouldn't have it. That makes it what the label on the bread says. It's all a great monster big thing up there. I went to the Culinary Institute of America up on the Hudson River. It's where they teach chefs how to be great chefs. A wonderful place. It takes months to get a reservation to go there for dinner. Well, we stopped there one time, and they served dinner, and I had these wonderful muffins. And the waiters that just stand all around, the students, because they did the cooking, they want to know what you think of you don't need a menu, they just put all this stuff on your table. So I picked the muffin up, and I turned to one of the students, and I said, where do you get the wheat for this muffin? It's wonderful. So we just buy it. No, you don't. Where do you get it? Well, I'll find out. So he ran through the room into the chef, and others gathered around the table. There were 10 or 15 of these students, all to see what the question about the muffin was. And so while they were standing there, I said, you know what he's going to tell me? When he comes back, he's going to say they get it in Canada, because American wheat isn't edible. This is an edible biscuit. This is good. He came back, and he was smiling. He said, you're right. We don't buy it here. We buy it in Canada. Now, that's quite a statement. It is the Culinary Institute of America, the top chef organization in this country. And to get proper food on our tables, at least on their table, they go to Canada.